Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 4.2 The Americans Are Coming. Last week, we set up the story of the Battle of Leipzig by diving into the myriad of reasons why the city's capture was a key objective for the Americans. Likewise, we looked at the importance of Leipzig to the Germans and how the city served as a nationalist symbol and industrial military powerhouse, which the flailing Third Reich could not afford to lose. This week, we'll look at the American advance through central Germany towards Leipzig. And we'll also cover the increasingly desperate actions taken by the German leadership in Leipzig in response to the growing American threat. On the 5th of April 1945, General Omar Bradley, head of US 12th Army Group, was satisfied that the immediate threat from German Army Group B had been neutralized, now that their forces were securely trapped within the Ruhr pocket. So Bradley allocated 18 divisions to continue reducing this pocket, whilst assigning the remaining 30 divisions within 12th Army Group the task of continuing the American drive into central Germany. And with this command, the US First Army's thrust towards the Elbe and Mulde rivers, and the US Fifth Corps' specific thrust towards Leipzig could begin. The Americans were confident, and enemy opposition on the way to Leipzig promised to be light. With Army Group B trapped inside the Ruhr pocket, the German defences along their western border had effectively collapsed. As a result, OKW, the German High Command, was left flailing around, urgently trying to scramble together whatever forces it could to plug the gap in the German lines. The only Wehrmacht formations available to hand were the remnants of the German 11th Army, led by General Otto Hitzfeld, which were stationed in the Harz mountain area. However, this army had no hope of holding back the Americans, because the 11th Army consisted of little more than a handful of ad hoc battle groups, along with demoralized and under-equipped infantry divisions composed of cadets and replacements. Realizing that more forces were urgently needed to prevent the American threat from breaking through, OKW quickly reconstituted the 12th Army under General Walter Wenck, who by now is an old friend of the podcast. OKW intended for this new 12th Army to link up with what remained of the 11th Army in order to launch a relief effort of the German forces trapped inside the Ruhr pocket. But the rapidly disintegrating military situation for the Germans quickly put paid to those relief efforts, as the subsequent American advance into central Germany proceeded at such a blistering speed that the OKW was instead forced to assign the 12th Army to defensive duties along the Elbe River in order to protect the western approaches to Berlin. This effectively meant that central Germany was devoid of any strong, coherent German military force, and this produced two outcomes for our story. Firstly, this lack of German units in the field guaranteed that cities such as Leipzig would soon find themselves under siege. And secondly, cities like Leipzig were effectively left to fend for themselves, with their defense resting entirely on whatever ragtag forces happened to be garrisoned there at the time. So with the door into central Germany now wide open, General Hodge's US First Army proceeded with their advance. US 7th Corps was given the task of advancing across the wooded and hilly terrain of the central Harz Mountains, whilst US 5th Corps was given the slightly easier route of advancing across the Thüringen Plains south of the Harz Mountains. Except for a series of small rivers, including the Weser, Saale, and the Weser-Elster rivers, there were no major geographical barriers impeding US Fifth Corps' advance towards Leipzig and their eventual objective of linking up with the Soviets along the Elbe and Mulde rivers. But as we'll see, the advance would not be without some unexpected surprises. Setting off east on the 5th of April, US Fifth Corps were led in their advance by the 2nd Infantry Division operating on the left flank and the 69th Infantry Division operating on the right. Expecting only light resistance, the 69th Infantry Division immediately ran into strong opposition from the German 11th Army at the town of Hanmunden, just north of Kassel. 2 days of hard fighting followed until Hanmunden was cleared of German troops and crossings over the River Werra were established. The US 2nd Infantry Division, meanwhile, ran into heavy resistance from German troops stationed in the town of Hofgeismar. And again, after a day of intense firefights, the division was able to break through on the 6th of April, and after successfully crossing the River Weser, they continued their advance east. Despite the intensity of these initial engagements, the two divisions met only fractured and spontaneous resistance as they drove forwards, as the Germans were unable to form anything close to a coherent defensive line. By the 8th of April, both American divisions had advanced another 20 kilometers, and they stood poised to attack the university town of Göttingen. For a brief moment, it looked as if the Americans would have to engage in a bitter fight to dislodge the German troops along the Leine River which ran through Göttingen, and that the town itself might see intense house-to-house fighting. But as the Americans were advancing on the town, General Hitzfeld, commander of the German 11th Army, declared Göttingen an open city, due to the thousands of wounded German soldiers who were lying in hospitals throughout the town. As a result, Göttingen fell without a shot being fired, and General Hitzfeld withdrew what remained of his German 11th Army back to the relative safety of the Harz Mountains. After securing Göttingen, US Fifth Corps continued in their advance, and on the 9th of April, the 2nd Infantry Division captured the town of Duderstadt, 25 kilometers east of Göttingen. Here, the successful taking of the town was made all the more sweeter by the liberation of 600 Allied prisoners of war. The 69th Infantry Division, meanwhile, were likewise making rapid progress, as they too occupied the town of Heilbad Heiligenstadt, a few kilometers to the southeast. By now, the 2nd and 69th Infantry Divisions were on the doorstep to Thüringen, and in only 5 days they had advanced well over 100 kilometers, which put them halfway to Leipzig. On the 10th of April, unsure as to the strength of the German forces ahead, and expecting tougher resistance as they neared the cities of Halle and Leipzig, the American commanders decided that their armored divisions should lead the advance from here on out. And as a result, the US Fifth Corps advanced towards Leipzig with the 9th Armored Division in the lead, followed closely by the 2nd and 69th Infantry Divisions. Meanwhile, to the north, US 7th Corps, who were tasked with taking the city of Halle, advanced with the 3rd Armored Division in the lead. Between the 10th and 11th of April, both the US 7th Corps and the US 5th Corps faced little resistance as their forces marched unopposed across western Thüringen. As the US 7th Corps approached the town of Nordhausen, however, they were stopped in their tracks, not by the machine gun fire of enemy troops, but by the scenes of utter misery and inhumanity they saw at the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Here, thousands of slave laborers had been worked to death building Hitler's deadly V-2 rockets. And such was the brutality of the conditions in the camp, it's estimated that up to 1/3 of the 60,000 people who were imprisoned there died. Most of the inmates had been evacuated by SS guards a few days previous, when it looked like the Americans were getting close. Some had been taken away on trains and relocated to other camps such as Sachsenhausen to the north of Berlin, but many of the prisoners were simply forced to march on foot. Anyone unable to keep up during the march was beaten and shot where they stood. Hundreds of sick inmates too weak to go on the forced march had been left by the SS to die in the camp, and it was these inmates who were liberated by the Americans on the 11th of April. Whilst US 7th Corps was dealing with the horror of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, US 5th Corps continued their advance across Thüringen into Sachsen-Anhalt. Their next goal was to reach the Saal River, west of Leipzig, before preparing themselves for the assault on Leipzig itself. Key targets along this advance included the towns of Merseburg, Weissenfels, and Naumburg, all of whom possessed key armaments factories for the Third Reich's war effort. Plus, Leuna, the home of the Third Reich's synthetic oil production facilities, also lay in the Americans' path. Initially, the 9th Armored Division was able to advance unchallenged. But everything changed when the lead American tanks rolled into the village of Schottery on the 12th of April. Schottery was 12 kilometers west of the Saal River and only 40 kilometers west of Leipzig. Suddenly, the American tank column was hit by a hail of shells fired by anti-aircraft guns, which made good use of the flat terrain to zero in on the American tanks. The attack was devastating, with 7 Sherman tanks, 4 trucks, and a half-track all being knocked out before supporting American infantry managed to take out the guns. Here, at the village of Schottery, the 9th Armored Division had rolled headfirst into the network of anti-aircraft guns positioned around Leipzig. Incredibly, the existence of this anti-aircraft network was long known to the US and British Air Forces, but this intelligence had not been passed down to the frontline troops sweeping towards Leipzig. So when the tanks of the 9th Armored Division advanced into the crosshairs of these guns, they had no idea about the danger they were in. The Americans believed that this network of anti-aircraft guns represented the outer defense line of Leipzig itself, and given the obvious threat these guns posed to American tanks, the commander of US 5th Corps, General Hübner, changed his attack plan for Leipzig, and he ordered the 9th Armored Division to bypass the city to the south and advance towards the Mulde River east of Leipzig instead. The assault on Leipzig itself would therefore be carried out by the men of the 2nd and 69th Infantry Divisions alone. Hübner ordered the 2nd Infantry Division to assault Leipzig from the west, whilst the 69th Infantry Division was to follow 9th Armoured to the south, before swinging up to attack Leipzig from the south in the east, cutting off potential escape routes for German units stationed in the city. As ordered, the 9th Armoured Division pulled back from the village of Schottery, and with the 69th Infantry Division in tow, they advanced upon the towns of Naumburg, Freiburg, and Weissenfels to the southwest of Leipzig. However, even the tactic of bypassing Leipzig to the south was fraught with difficulties, because the 9th Armoured and 69th Infantry Divisions had to engage in fierce battles with well-dug-in German troops for control of the vital bridges over the Saal River. Plus, every time it looked as if the Americans had broken the back of the German defenders and were on the cusp of capturing key bridges, the German defenders often blew up those bridges at the last moment, delaying the American advance even further. That said, the Americans were able to force a breakthrough when an intact bridge over the Saar River was captured by American infantry on the 13th of April in the town of Naumburg. This enabled the 9th Armored Division to proceed in its advance south of Leipzig. Whilst the American tanks sped on, the 69th Infantry Division was instead bogged down in heavy fighting in the town of Weissenfels, which had a German garrison of 1,500 men. After 2 days of street fighting, the Americans captured Weissenfels, but by then all of the bridges in the town had been blown, forcing the American infantrymen to cross the Saar River in boats. Nevertheless, with this breakthrough, the 69th Infantry Division could now advance towards the southern approaches to Leipzig. Whilst the Americans had made a breakthrough to the south of Leipzig, the 2nd Infantry Division had continued its advance towards Leipzig from the west. The main obstacle the men had to overcome was the dense network of anti-aircraft guns. But without armoured support, the infantry units had little hope in tackling these guns head-on. Therefore, they opted to limit their movements during the daytime, instead using the cover of darkness to creep up as close as possible to the guns in order to radio in targets for the American artillery to rain fire down upon. The German anti-aircraft gunners, not expecting a torrent of artillery fire to suddenly start shredding them apart in the middle of the night, quickly surrendered or fled. With this success, the 2nd Infantry Division proceeded towards the western approaches to Leipzig, capturing Merseburg, its airport, and the important synthetic oil plant at Leuna on the 15th of April. With these victories, the division was now barely 20 kilometers from Leipzig. The capture of the airport at Merseburg was a vital logistical success for the Americans, as it enabled C-47 transport planes to land with vital supplies of food, ammunition, and fuel. The fact that the Americans were able to resupply their frontline troops in such an effective manner once again demonstrated the stark contrast between the well-supplied and logistically superior American forces and their undersupplied and rather chaotic German opponents. And the constant resupply of the American frontline units meant their assault on Leipzig could proceed without delay. The Americans were on a roll, and on the 16th of April, a task force attached to the 9th Armored Division reached Colditz, roughly 30 kilometers to the southeast of Leipzig. Here, they liberated 1,800 Allied prisoners of war being held in the infamous Colditz Castle. On the 17th of April, the 2nd and 69th Infantry Divisions pushed further, reaching the outskirts of Leipzig itself, where they made preparations for their final assault, which was scheduled to launch in the early hours of the 18th of April. Meanwhile, to the north of Leipzig, the city of Halle was also under siege by the U.S. 104th Infantry Division from the U.S. 7th Corps. By the 17th of April, 2/3 of Halle already lay in American hands. And whilst the full surrender of the city was not secured until the 19th of April, Halle's embattled German units were unable to render any assistance to the Leipzig garrison. In short, Leipzig was surrounded. The speed of the American advance across central Germany in the first weeks of April shook the military and civilian leadership of Leipzig to their core. And it dawned upon them that not only did their city lay directly in the American crosshairs, but that they would also be receiving no support from German high command in the defense of their city. The Third Reich was falling apart, and the High Command in Berlin was far more concerned about the impending Soviet assault from the east than the movements of the British and the Americans to the west. So any available forces the Wehrmacht could call upon were being hurriedly marshalled and sent to boost the defense of the capital, or to the German defenses along the Seelow Heights. As a result, cities such as Leipzig were effectively abandoned by the senior German leadership in Berlin. And as we'll soon see, the ability and the willingness of the Leipzig garrison to defend the city would thus depend entirely on the personalities of the civil and military leaders in charge of the city. And these leaders fell into two diametrically opposed camps. In one camp, you had the mayor of Leipzig, Alfred Freiberg, the deputy mayor, Kurt Lissow, the police chief, von Grollmann, and the senior Wehrmacht Kampfkommandant, General Major von Siegesar. All of these men were realists who quickly recognized the futility of trying to defend Leipzig, understanding as they did that the size and quality of the German units in the city would prove no match to the might of the American forces advancing rapidly towards them. The other group, however, represented by Volkssturm commander Walter Dönecke and the Hazag factory director Paul Budin, were committed Nazis who believed that the only honourable course of action was to defend the city to the last man. To them, it didn't matter how many soldiers or civilians were killed in the process, because all that mattered was that Hitler had decreed no city should surrender. Unsurprisingly, as the Americans crept ever closer to Leipzig, the wildly diverging views of these two groups burst out into the open, preventing any sufficient defense of Leipzig from being established. As the Americans advanced across central Germany in early April, the senior leadership in Leipzig convened an emergency meeting to discuss the looming threat to their city. The meeting was hosted by the Hazag factory director Paul Budin, and attendees included General von Siegesar, Leipzig Volkssturm leader Walter Dönecke, and the police chief von Grollmann, along with the Gauleiter of Saxony Martin Mutschmann. As soon as the meeting started, Paul Budin angrily demanded that von Siegesar explain what the defense strategy for Leipzig was. Siegesar, a proud career soldier, retorted that the defense of Leipzig was a military matter and thus didn't concern civilian businessmen like Budin. Budin, however, was eager to show just how much of a fanatical Nazi he was, and he simply replied to Siegesar that according to the Führer's directive on the defense of the Reich, Leipzig must be defended to the last man. Budin then followed up this snarky comment by claiming that von Siegesar was a sickly man who lacked the necessary combat experience, moral fibre, and fighting spirit to be trusted with the job of leading the defence of the city. Budin demanded that von Siegesar immediately be replaced with someone better suited to the job. As a testament to Paul Budin's influence, his wishes were granted, and to the surprise of the civil and military leadership of Leipzig, von Siegesar was indeed dismissed as Kampfkommandant on the 10th of April. It was announced that he was to be replaced by the unknown figure of Colonel von Ponset. In response to the sacking of von Siegesar, Police Chief von Grollmann convened a second emergency meeting at his police headquarters, again attended by the leadership of Leipzig. With von Siegesar now removed from command, von Grollmann instead pressed the Volkssturm commander Walter Dönecke for a plan to defend the city. Walter Dönecke was not a military man, nor an experienced tactician, so he naively outlined his makeshift defense plan. Dönecke argued that the main threat to Leipzig came from the west. Well done. Therefore, it made sense, in his mind at least, only to set up defensive lines facing the west. Firstly, he proposed setting up a defense line a few kilometers west of the city, which was to be manned by ideologically motivated Hitler Youth, armed with Panzerfausts and anti-tank grenades. A second defense line was then to be set up along the city limits, manned by regular troops and the Volkssturm, whilst a third line of defense would then follow the Weiße Elster River, which ran through the city, separating the smaller western half of Leipzig from the larger eastern half. This third defense line wouldn't even be manned, he proposed. Instead, whoever made a fighting retreat from the second defense line could fall back to the third defense line. Brilliant. And if things really looked bad for the defenders of Leipzig, well, Dönecke said they could always blow up the bridges leading over the Weiße Elster River to slow down the American advance. The police chief von Grollmann was appalled by this supposed defense plan, and later wrote, "The defense plans drawn up by the Volkssturm leader Dönecke are the craziest things I have ever heard in my life. They could only have come from the mind of a man who had never been a soldier." Von Grollmann argued that the use of Hitler Youth boys to man the first defensive line to the west of the city was nothing short of child murder, as these underage boys, inexperienced and sometimes physically incapable of holding heavy weaponry, were likely to get slaughtered by the crack American troops approaching Leipzig. In military terms, the use of such inexperienced boys was also pointless anyway, as they were going to provide nothing more than a minor inconvenience to the incoming Americans. Plus, there was little strategic sense in only setting up defensive lines along the western approaches to Leipzig, because what if the Americans, used their tanks to encircle the city from multiple directions? Who would stop them then? The question went unanswered. Lastly, the thought of blowing up the bridges over the Weiße Elster River enraged von Grollmann, because these bridges had pipes along them supplying gas, water, and electricity to the western districts of Leipzig. Blowing up these bridges would thus leave around 1/3 of the city's population in the western districts to wallow in squalor. In protest at the absurdity of the defense plan being proposed, and in recognition that fighting the Americans would be pointless anyway, von Grollmann refused to commit his police force to the defense of the city. The meeting ended in acrimony. Whilst the civil and military commanders squabbled over how to defend Leipzig, the Nazi authorities wasted no time in removing all traces of the persecution they had inflicted on opponents of the regime. For instance, in accordance with orders set out by Heinrich Himmler, the SS and the Gestapo started burning records of all political prisoners who had been imprisoned in Leipzig. Political prisoners who could still be evacuated out of the city were transported to camps and prisons elsewhere in the Third Reich. However, those political prisoners who could not be moved out of Leipzig were to be disposed of permanently. However, whilst the orders handed down to the SS and to the Gestapo were clear, this doesn't mean that the orders were always followed to the letter. In some instances, the order to liquidate political prisoners was carried out mercilessly and without hesitation, such as when the Gestapo murdered 52 political prisoners in a mass shooting on the 12th of April at the Wehrmacht parade ground in the northern district of Lindenthal. But not all political prisoners in Leipzig would meet this same tragic fate. For instance, one group was marched in a southwesterly direction out of the city. But once the group reached the city limits, their prison guards inexplicably set them all free, without harm. Likewise, another large group of 150 political prisoners were taken to the area around the Bayerischer Bahnhof in the south of the city. And once they arrived, they were suddenly released by their Gestapo guards. There is no clear answer as to why some Gestapo and SS men showed such leniency and mercy at this late stage, but we can assume that it wasn't done out of the kindness of their hearts. More likely, they were keen to save their own skin and didn't relish being found guarding political prisoners when the Americans showed up. But whilst there are some stories of mercy being shown to prisoners, the sad truth is that for most of the thousands of inmates and labourers slaving away in Leipzig's factories, or in the Tekla concentration camp, there was little chance of survival. Between April the 13th and 14th, all labour camps in Leipzig were emptied, with the healthiest inmates sent on a death march to the Erzgebirge Mountains in the east. Forced to march non-stop for days without food or water, it's estimated that between 1,500 to 2,000 slave labourers from Leipzig died during these forced marches, either from starvation or from being murdered by their guards along the way. Meanwhile, the SS started liquidating any remaining concentration camp inmates in Leipzig who were too sick or frail to march. And as we'll see in next week's episode, those killings continued right up until the moment American forces entered the city. This just goes to show that despite the impending implosion of the Third Reich, the wheels of evil continue to turn right up until the very end. But whilst the Gestapo and the SS were busy putting their affairs into order, another member of the Nazi elite in Leipzig took a different path. Paul Budin, the director of the Hazag factory, took stock of the situation, and realizing that he would be condemned as a Nazi in the post-war era, Budin took the easy way out. Rather than choosing to fight on the front lines, however, an action he demanded that others do, Budin decided to commit suicide. On the 13th of April, shortly before midnight, an almighty explosion ripped through the Hazag factory. There are conflicting reports as to what exactly happened. But what we do know is that following the explosion, a fire quickly engulfed the complex. Some reports state that Budin invited some of his closest associates to a buffet in a meeting room, and when the room was full, Budin detonated a series of pre-wired explosives, killing him and everyone present. The Leipzig police chief von Grollmann, meanwhile, reported that Budin only committed suicide with his wife, though, according to his version, this suicide was still undertaken in a rather extravagant fashion, not by using pistols, but through the use of Panzerfausts. In any case, Budin's suicide would not be the last. With the general sense of despair and uncertainty coursing through Leipzig, it looked like the American capture of the city was by now merely a formality. And it's possible that if the realist camp, led by von Grollmann, had got their way, then Leipzig could have been surrendered to the Americans without a fight. However, these hopes were dashed when the new Leipzig Kampfkommandant, Colonel von Ponzett, arrived in the city on the 14th of April. Von Ponzett's appointment as Kampfkommandant was truly mind-boggling, because von Ponzett was not familiar with Leipzig at all, nor did he know the makeup and strength of the Leipzig garrison. He also had no knowledge of the geographical layout of the city or its defences. But, unsurprisingly, von Ponset had been selected for the position largely due to his unwavering belief in Adolf Hitler. And thus, once again, in our analysis of the Third Reich in April 1945, we have yet another example of a high-ranking military commander being chosen for the job, not due to their skill and expertise, but rather due to their fanaticism and loyalty to the Nazi cause. But regardless of his suitability for the role, von Ponset was keen to reinvigorate the defense of the city with his fighting spirit. So he convened another meeting on the evening of the 14th of April in order to formally introduce himself to the Leipzig leadership. In the meeting, von Ponset outlined to the Mayor Freiberg, police chief von Grollmann, and the Volkssturm leader Dönecke that he was determined to fight to the last man and to the last bullet if needs be, and that under no circumstances was Leipzig to be surrendered to the Americans. Von Ponset expected everyone in the city to do their duty, and he threatened to court-martial and execute anyone who refused to fight. These weren't just empty threats, and in the days leading up to the American assault on the city, some Wehrmacht soldiers were indeed shot for supposedly refusing to fight. These killings served as an effective warning measure to anyone else who dared to think of surrendering. The meeting between von Ponset and the rest of the Leipzig leadership was unbelievably tense, and a clear rift developed between the hardliners on one side and the realists on the other side. Von Grollmann begged von Ponset to avoid fighting in the city, and as a last resort, von Grollmann once again stated that he would refuse to order his policemen to fight. But every request to avoid bloodshed fell on deaf ears. Von Grollmann was able to secure one concession, however, in that von Ponset agreed not to blow the bridges over the Weisse Elster River, which would have cut off the western half of the city. However, no agreement could be found between the two factions, and the meeting ended with a distinct lack of unity between the military and civilian leadership of the city. Von Ponset, however, seemed unconcerned by this lack of consensus, and he threw himself into the task of preparing Leipzig to make a defiant stand against the Americans. He immediately ordered the Volkssturm to start preparing roadblocks and anti-tank barriers throughout the city. But given the last-minute nature of these defences, the roadblocks often consisted of nothing more than tram cars filled with stones, complemented with piles of rubble from bombed-out buildings. Moreover, in an effort to psychologically prepare the people of Leipzig for the upcoming battle, on the 16th of April, von Ponset ordered the city's air raid sirens to ring out, warning them of the approaching American forces. That said, despite von Ponset's best efforts to prepare the city, he quickly realized that the dire state of the garrison forces available to him made an effective defense of Leipzig impossible. He knew that Dönecke's previous defense plan was unworkable and futile. Plus, a defense of the entire city was out of the question anyway, given how few troops von Ponset had under his command. Therefore, on the 17th of April, von Ponset abandoned all ideas of defending the entirety of Leipzig, and instead he chose to focus the majority of Leipzig's troops into two fortified positions in the city. The first fortified location was to be the Neues Rathaus, or the New Town Hall. Here, Volkssturm leader Dönecke was ordered to barricade the building and the surrounding streets with 500 of his Volkssturm men. The second fortified location was to be the Battle of the Nations Monument, or, in German, the Völkerschlachtdenkmal. Here, von Ponset intended to use the 20-foot thick walls as the perfect fortress from which he and 300 of his best men could make a heroic last stand against the invaders. Von Pontset was determined to hold out at the monument for as long as possible, and he ordered that 2 months' worth of food, water, and ammunition be stored within the crypt of the monument. Yes, the thick concrete walls of the Völkerschlachtdenkmal made it an impregnable fortress which would likely repel any attempts to capture it. However, the monument was located in the southeast of the city, far from the city centre, where the main political and commercial buildings were located. Plus, if the Americans wanted to, they could simply bottle up the German troops hiding inside the monument and bypass the building entirely. The truth was, von Pontset wasn't concerned about any perceived military advantage he might gain from fortifying the monument. Because, as a committed Nazi and fervent nationalist, he was far more concerned with occupying the site for ideological and symbolic reasons. During the Battle of the Nations in 1813, German soldiers had valiantly stood up to Napoleon and defeated the foreign invader. Von Pontset, in his warped mind, hoped to do the same once again. Of course, whilst the Neues Rathaus and the Völkerschlachtdenkmal received the majority of men and supplies, that's not to say that the rest of Leipzig was completely devoid of German forces. In fact, hundreds of Hitler Youth boys, Volkssturm members, Wehrmacht soldiers, and Luftwaffe personnel were dispersed throughout the city. Their objectives were to hold key choke points such as the Zeppelin Bridge over the Weiße Elster River, or Leipzig's main train station, the Hauptbahnhof, to the north of the city centre. However, these disparate units were isolated, disorganised, and too few in number. And due to the ridiculous decision to concentrate so much manpower and firepower into holding the Neues Rathaus and the Völkerschlachtdenkmal, the scattered German forces stationed elsewhere in the city were unlikely to hold back 2 full American infantry divisions. Once again, we can see that in the dying days of the Reich, all sense of military strategy and logic had abandoned the minds of fanatics like von Pontset. As soon as von Pontset barricaded himself behind the walls of the Völkerschlachtdenkmal, the mayor of Leipzig, Alfred Freiberg, approached von Grollmann and asked him to take over civilian authority. His hope was that von Grollmann could use his policemen to protect the people of Leipzig, and perhaps bring order to the city before the Americans arrived. Von Grollmann, however, argued that with fanatics like Walter Dönecke and von Pontset still commanding hundreds of heavily armed fanatical troops in the city, von Grollmann's lightly armed police officers had no hope of enforcing any order on the streets. As the evening of the 17th of April drew to a close, SS men were seen driving around the outskirts of the city, forcibly removing any white flags which had been hung up by civilians. Meanwhile, the men of the US 2nd and 69th Infantry Divisions were camped outside of the city, preparing to launch their assault. Thank you for listening to the Europe at War podcast. If you're enjoying the show and want to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button. You can also help spread the word by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really makes a difference and helps more people discover the show. And if you like what I do, why not consider becoming a Patreon supporter? In doing so, you will help keep the podcast marching forward. To find out all the details, please check out patreon.com/Europe at War. Thank you.